Classical music feels timeless, eternal, as if the symphonies, operas, and concertos we know today were born from pure inspiration, untouched by the mundane world. But here's the twist. No masterpiece exists without money. And classical music was shaped as much by bankers, nobles, merchants, and city councils as it was by genius. Today, we peel back the velvet curtain to reveal the secret financial machinery that powered Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and the world that shaped them. This isn't the story they tell in textbooks. This is the story of the economy that built classical music. When we talk about Bach or Mozart today, we often talk about them like prophets, minds touched by the heavens. But the composers themselves lived in a world where music was a job, a trade, a service. In the 1600s and 1700s, a composer wasn't a celebrity or a visionary. He was closer to a well-trained artisan, a musical architect hired to design a sonic structure for the glory of someone far more powerful. Most composers didn't write symphonies because inspiration struck at dawn. They wrote because a noble, a bishop, or a court treasury officer requested 6 new sonatas by Thursday. Music had customers, and customers had demands. This is the foundation classical music was built on. Many people think classical music survived thanks to kings and queens. That's only partly true. The real ecosystem was far more complicated. There were aristocrats who kept orchestras as status symbols, merchant families who used music to climb social ladders, and city guilds that funded public performances. Wealthy widows hosted private concerts in their salons, and religious institutions employed composers full-time. There were even subscription societies that essentially pre-funded new works. Classical music was not one golden pipeline from a palace to a composer. It was a messy web of relationships, negotiations, and economic compromises. And every composer had to navigate it to survive. Take Johann Sebastian Bach. He didn't write the famous Brandenburg concertos just because he was inspired. He wrote them as a job application, a musical CV. He composed them to impress a potential employer who, in the end, never even hired him. This was the typical reality. Composers were employees. They cooked up whatever musical dish their employer wanted. If you had a church job, you wrote cantatas. If you had a court job, you wrote orchestral suites. A civic job, you wrote music for celebrations and funerals. The quality of the music we revere today was often determined by who could afford the composer's next meal. Then, Mozart disrupts everything. He left secure employment because he believed he could earn more independently. That might sound bold, artistic, even romantic. In reality, it was financially dangerous. But Mozart made a discovery. The rising merchant middle class wanted music just as much as the nobility did. Instead of relying on one powerful patron, Mozart created the world's first real subscription concert model. Citizens paid in advance for the right to attend his performances. Dozens of middle-class supporters replaced a single aristocrat. This was revolutionary. Mozart essentially invented musical crowdfunding centuries before the concept existed. And those beautiful piano concertos we love? Many were paid for by bankers, lawyers, and wealthy professionals, not royalty. He didn't just play for the elite. He democratized who could shape culture. Beethoven is often seen as the lone genius wrestling thunder from the sky. But financially, he was protected by an extraordinary arrangement. 3 aristocrats pooled their money and signed a contract guaranteeing Beethoven an annual salary, as long as he stayed in Vienna. This wasn't charity. It was a cultural investment. His patrons wanted Vienna to be the heart of Europe's musical future, and Beethoven was their star asset. Without that financial safety net, Beethoven would never have had the freedom to innovate the way he did. No Ninth Symphony, no late quartets, no massive, structurally daring works that audiences initially found confusing. Revolutionary art requires stability. Beethoven's brilliance needed benefactors. Even radicals need revenue. Beyond the well-known dukes and archdukes, classical music relied on some fascinating, sometimes bizarre supporters. There were counts who maintained full orchestras just to impress guests, and Russian nobles who built entire opera houses as political flexes. There were salon hostesses in Paris who discovered promising composers, and wealthy amateurs who commissioned pieces just to attach their names to art. There were even Prussian kings who challenged composers to counterpoint duels. These individuals didn't compose a single note, yet they shaped entire eras. Every bold experiment, every large ensemble, every massive opera depended on someone with money, influence, ego, or passion. Sometimes all four. One of the most overlooked truths in music history is that the economics of the time shaped the actual sound of the music. Why are early symphonies so short? Because orchestras were expensive and rehearsal time was limited. Why did virtuosic piano works explode in the 19th century? Because wealthy patrons wanted to sponsor dazzling performances in their own homes. Why did opera become so massive, with huge casts and long-running times? Because only wealthy courts and opera societies could afford productions that grand. Even musical forms evolved because of who funded them. String quartets were ideal for intimate salons. Large symphonies emerged when public concert halls grew. The economy didn't just support music, it engineered it. But classical music wasn't just built on funding. It was haunted by the lack of it. Some of the greatest composers in history suffered financially, not because of incompetence, but because their ecosystems failed them. Schubert couldn't secure stable patronage and died young, leaving behind masterpieces the world ignored at first. Vivaldi, once a celebrated star, lost favor with his patrons and died nearly penniless. And Mozart, for all his genius, struggled financially for most of his life. Talent alone was never enough. A composer's possibilities were constantly shaped by the unpredictable tides of wealth and fashion. By the 1800s, something new began to change the landscape: public concerts. Cities were growing, the middle class was expanding, and music societies were forming. Opera houses opened their doors to ticket-paying audiences. This changed everything. Now, composers didn't have to please just one powerful patron. They could write for thousands. This liberated music, but it also made it riskier. Beethoven could shock audiences with bold new forms because he didn't rely on one aristocrat's taste. Liszt could become a touring superstar. Tchaikovsky could be supported by a wealthy widow who admired his work from afar. Music entered the modern age when patronage became less personal and more collective. We tend to think genius exists outside the world, above the world, untouched by reality. But classical music tells us a different story. Art is always tied to economics. Genius is always shaped by opportunity. Innovation is always funded. Behind every luminous masterpiece is a chain of decisions. Who paid for the orchestra? Who funded the printing of the sheet music? Who kept the composer alive long enough to create? Who risked money on a performance that might fail? The unseen economy of classical music is not a footnote. It is the engine of the entire tradition. So the next time you hear a symphony or a piano concerto blooming through a hall, remember, you're not just hearing a composer. You're hearing an entire economic system: nobles, merchants, cities, salons, and dreamers, all converging to make that music possible. Classical music wasn't created by genius alone. It was carried by networks of supporters who believed in the power of art enough to fund it. They are the forgotten architects of Western music. This is their story. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey, consider subscribing for more stories from behind the music.